I've given a lot of talks about nuclear weapons, destruction, and the end of the world. And the question that comes up again and again, the most common question, the question I find most difficult, is what the hell can I do about this? I don't have any answers for you. It's a really difficult question, but this is what my talk is going to be focusing on. It's going to be answering the question that you should be asking, what can I do about this? It's been for me a really long, difficult personal journey. I started off with clarity, certainty that I was right. I've become more doubtful as I've gone along. But that journey of doubt and difficulty, with lots of shocks to the system and lots of wake-up calls, has left me feeling that there is an answer, or rather, more importantly, there are many answers to the question that I've just asked you. One of the things that I've done is crafted a stepping stones approach for nuclear disarmament diplomacy. And I've convinced 16 countries without nuclear weapons to adopt this approach and create what's called the Stockholm Initiative for Nuclear Disarmament Diplomacy. And that initiative has breathed some level of new life into the international process. But first, let me just tell you where I come from. I come from the University of Cambridge, working for a centre that studies the end of the world. It's not fun. The threats we study, be they climate change, nuclear war, the rise of artificial intelligence, the biological weapons, pandemics, volcanoes, asteroids, actually not those last two, because we do study those, but this isn't the thing. The threats are deeply ingrained in how we've organised our society. Not just in this generation, not just in the last, but for many thousands of years. I've been looking myself at nuclear weapons. I've co-hosted talks, secret talks, before the official Iran talks on Iran's nuclear program. I've cooperated with a Russian hacker to expose the cyber vulnerabilities of UK nuclear weapon systems. I've set up and run this country's most credible commission on the future of Britain's nuclear weapons policy. I've broken into nuclear weapons bases. I've organised demonstrations and was indeed part of organising the biggest demonstrations this world has ever seen in 2003 against the Iraq War. I've been a talk show host on state Iranian television. And I've been one of this country's most foremost green politicians. In all of that, in doing all of that, I stand before you today with a degree of humility. Because the talks that I've heard have been extraordinary. We face a huge amount of uncertainty as we go forward. My older brother often tells me there is no hope. And it's not true. There is plenty of hope. The message I want you to take away from this talk is that we may feel trapped in this degree of certainty. We may feel that we are surrounded by hostility and pessimism. But we have to have hope, and there is reason for hope. And I'll give you some clues as to how we go forward. This is called the cone of future trends. It's used by a lot of people who engage in future studies, which is a rising way of looking at the world. We may have a lot of hatred, greed, cruelty in the world. There may be futures here that involve significant pain and suffering for millions and billions of people. But there's also cooperation and altruism. There is the sense that the human condition is both positive and negative. If we can believe in positive futures, then we do have hope. But let me take you back to my teenage years. When I was 15, I took part in my first anti-nuclear march, 1983. I was convinced we were screwed. We were in the middle of the Cold War. There was only one way out, and that was nuclear annihilation. I couldn't see a way out, and more importantly, neither could anyone else. When I hear today's youth talking about the inevitability of climate change and the end of the world, I can relate to that. But you know, 2 years later, when Ronald Reagan, the American president, who at the time had accused the Soviet Union of being the evil empire, was sitting down with its leader and was intent on abolishing nuclear weapons. 5 years later, we had the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union dissolved. It didn't solve the world's problems, but it made us a great deal safer. And what it does do is it gives an example of how pessimism is not always appropriate. I've heard this word several times today. It's powerful. I want to give you a couple of personal stories that demonstrate it. When I was 24, I was cycling to work and I was knocked over by a car into the path of an oncoming lorry. It was travelling at great speed. I looked up, saw the lorry, there was no way it was going to stop in time. In that moment, and I can tell you this for true now because I've experienced it, my life did flash before me and time almost stood still. And as I looked at my fate, I felt calm. I thought, I've lived a good life, 24. I've lived a good life. I've made good choices. If it's time for me to go now, I'm ready. Who knew? Brakes on lorries are much better than I thought. I left that scene realizing that the day-to-day anxieties I faced are ridiculous. In that moment of 5 to 6 seconds, I had greater progress in my psychological makeup than years of cognitive behavioral therapy would have had. 20 years later, I was in Tehran, Iran. I was at a conference, 2000, almost entirely Iranians living abroad. And we were told we had to surrender our passports and mobile phones to a couple of ice cream vans, like several hundred people over there, and we had to pass these passports and mobile phones over the heads, and they would then disappear into these vans because the president of Iran was about to address our conference. In that moment, I had to let go of all fear and surrender that document and that mobile phone, thinking maybe I'll never see it again. But this is what we're asked to do, is to place our faith in the hands of complete strangers, many of whom we have been brought up to vilify, and to imagine how do we cooperate. I did see that mobile phone and that passport, and I came back and I lived to tell the tale. We're brought up in this culture with a strong story of individualism. We're brought up to think we can be heroes, invulnerable, that it's important to see the world in terms of power. But that leads to competition, it leads to rage, and it leads to violence. When in September 2001 those planes went into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the US responded with rage. How could it be possible that they could be vulnerable? I was, at the time, running or helping to run the Stop the War Coalition in this country, and we soon were ending up organising those demonstrations I was talking about. When I was sitting there in the committee, I was asking the question, what is our alternative? But my colleagues didn't want to hear. They had a very simple question, and quite rightly they were focused on it. Sorry, a very simple answer. Don't attack Iraq. And we had a majority of opinion in this country and pretty much across the world. But I think we in the peace movement failed because we were focused on the negative. We could accuse, quite rightly, our governments of neo-imperialism. We could accuse them of putting supplies of oil ahead of human rights. And we could accuse them of hypocrisy and oppression. But we have to come up with positive alternative stories. And if you leave listening to my talk with no other thing than this, then remember this. It is the positive stories we tell about what the future can look like, rather than the negative stories about where we are today and the negative stories about what could happen in the future, that is going to bring us out of this mess. And that requires stories around pluralism, valuing different opinions, about relationships, and about the way in which we relate to the ecosystems which we depend upon. Let me introduce you to a heuristic. A heuristic is a rule of thumb. It's not necessarily a proof, but it is a rule that helps you live a better life. It's related to a more famous heuristic called Occam's razor. This one is Hanlon's razor. It basically tells you that cock-up is almost always more likely than conspiracy. We often think of people as being malicious, greedy, psychopathic, but actually, more likely, they're reckless, like me, distracted, or stupid. Think about sharing a dorm with 3 other people. I'm not sure many of you do that, I don't know. It's very easy when you think about your roommates to think of them as dirty, loud, aggressive, or any other description. But actually, they're probably just trying to live a decent life alongside you. Much better to stop blaming them or thinking about their downsides and engaging with some degree of compassion. The same goes for global institutions. I've spent my whole life judging nuclear weapons systems and the people that run them. I've thought in various ways that they are misguided or worse, evil. But when I do that, I turn them into others, people that I can't engage with. If we think about these systems as us and them systems, we've already failed. We need to create stories that are not about the power differentials, although that is absolutely part of the system we're in. We need to go beyond that into how we reach across and create the dialogues. One of the big insights I had when I was setting up the Stepping Stones approach was the idea that my most fundamental belief of all, that nuclear weapons were really bad, could be wrong. That was really tough, having devoted many years of my life to this project. But I had to think that I could be wrong if I was going to engage with people who saw the world very differently from me. And having thought that I could be wrong and opening to their perspective, something magical happened. There was sort of this kind of gap of doubt that they could feel, and it allowed us to meet in that middle place and explore our perspectives. And in starting to put together this Stepping Stones approach to nuclear disarmament, I came up with a model. Now, you don't have to spend too long on this because it's a bit complicated and it's probably a talk in itself, but let me simplify it for you. It's about looking at the world. It's about dreaming of how the world could be different. It's about meeting other people with different dreams, exploring those dreams, and then it's about backcasting. It's about looking about how we can move in the general direction of those dreams and having a dialogue about how we do that. It's about then taking early, incremental action to change the world, because by changing the world with action, we open the possibilities for further change. It may be that we think that massive change is required. Well, it absolutely is. Massive change is required. But we're not going to achieve that massive change without taking those steps every moment of every day. Little steps. Steps in thinking about how we relate to others, in thinking about how we can create a life that is well lived. And we can then evaluate and adapt and move again to the new day with our new music or whatever inspirations we have. The thing about these visions is that they are not manifestos in the way that I created manifestos when I was in the Green Party. They're more guide stars. They're more thoughts, ideas, inspirations that have relevance for this day. It's about adding to the power story and thinking about how we can change without forcing it. It's about welcoming the uncertainty that is inevitable because change is inevitable. There's one cancerous story I really want to raise, and that is the story of the powerful that change is difficult or impossible. It's a lie. Change is inevitable. So let me conclude with my ending message, which is it is important to dig deep, understand what is wrong, open to the full horror and despair of the world that we live in. But the despair is because there is also beauty and hope in this world that we need to be saving, and there is possibility of extraordinary potential. We can escape the dysfunctions that drive our society, and we can draw others in with very different perspectives from ours, even very surprising allies, like the ally that I have today, who used to be in charge of Britain's nuclear weapons systems. That requires us to dream. It requires us to backcast and think about how we get to some of these places. It requires us to discuss and be open and to be recognizing that some of the things we might believe in could be wrong. But importantly, it requires us every day to think about how we can act within the world that we live. And that means thinking and being true to the values that we hold. And in all of that, you're not powerless. You can do it.